Okay, great. So let's start off here. First of all, would you please pronounce and spell your name for us?
Well, my full name is Delbert L. Ballard, Leo for center, Delbert, Ballard, and I go by Del commonly.
All right, thank you. My name is Douglas O'Regan. I'm conducting an oral history interview here on February 18th, 2016. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. I'll be talking with Mr. Ballard about his experiences working on the Hanford site, living in this community. First of all, could you start us off, just walk us through your life in sort of a brief term before you came to this area?
Well, I was raised on a dryland wheat farm in Montana, so I know what work is all about, and I was a student in a little high school. There's only 7 of us in our graduating class, and so I was sort of a country boy and went to college in Montana State University, and I graduated from there in 1951. And just prior to that, the General Electric Company, of course, had been there to do interviews. They were scoping for recruiting for engineers, and I was a civil engineer graduate. And there was other recruiters through too. I had an offer from San Francisco Shipyard, and another one from the Soil Conservation Service in Montana. But I wanted to get a job with GE, so I had the interview, but no really positive recognition that they were going to give me an offer. They were interviewing a large number of people. So graduation day came around, and I still hadn't gotten a letter from GE, but the mail came that morning, and lo and behold, there it was. So I was really pleased at that. And so my initial job right out of college was coming to Hanford, working for the General Electric Company as a rotational training, in the rotational training program. And they had hired that year, or previous year, and actually in 49, 50, and 51, they had hired about 300 to 350 tech grads. And I was one of the later ones getting here. I didn't get here till July. So most of the good jobs were assigned, but in the rotational training program. My first assignment was with a rather mundane assignment to the transportation department. The next one was a more interesting job with the inspection department, and that was over in the shipyard in Bremerton. And at that time, Hanford was undergoing what they called, I believe, the Korean expansion. The Korean War was underway in full force at that time when I got out of school. As a matter of fact, I thought I was going to be drafted, but I tried to enlist I'm diverting here a little bit, but tried to enlist in the Air Force to be a pilot, but my eyes weren't good enough, so I got rejected for that. So then when I knew that the GE job was a deferred job, I thought, well, that's an alternate I'd just as soon pursue. So anyway, when I got here on the rotational training program, that's what it was. The individuals were assigned to different locations for training purposes and for filling job needs. The second assignment was, as I said, in inspection department in the shipyard in Bremerton. At that time, the shipyard was fabricating the biological shield blocks for the C reactor. That was one of the expansion efforts at Hanford, increasing the production capacity. And so that was an interesting job over there at the shipyard, doing inspection and learning a lot about inspection techniques and components and so forth. Another month after that, I was rotating around the Seattle area, inspecting other components that were being manufactured for the C reactor. The C reactor, as you know, was the one that was built right alongside of the B reactor out at Hanford. And it started up in 53, I believe. But out of the rotational training program, I was assigned then to a construction area out in the 300 area. They were fabricating the laboratories, or building the laboratories out there. Radiochemistry, radiometallurgy, pile tech, and the machine shop, and the library. That area of the Hanford 300 area was just under construction, so I got assigned to help in the field engineering in that job. That was an interesting project, and I learned a lot there in that job. And from there, I went into other project engineering work, including later years. The K reactors were under construction, and I was involved in laying up the graphite of that reactor, the K East reactors. And I stayed in project engineering with GE all my life, or all my employment time was with GE. They left here in 64. Yeah, Battelle came in 65. But two of the projects that I followed after the K reactors, one was a critical mass lab in the 300 area, which was a facility for evaluating critical shapes and sizes for plutonium vessels. It was a research job, research facility. And that project was lump sum construction and plant forces for the completion of putting the process equipment in. The next job I had was the high temperature lattice test reactor in the 300 area. That's a reactor that probably hasn't gotten much publicity. It was a small graphite reactor. But that was a job I was very proud of because I was the sole project engineering function at the time. The design was done by an organization that was just brought on as GE was being phased out. It was the Vitro Engineering Company. They had the detailed design of the job, and the construction was done lump sum, and then J.A. Jones did the reactor installation. I can tell quite a bit of detail about that reactor if you're interested, but it was an experimental facility also for evaluating different lattice spacings for graphite moderated reactors. And it was electrically heated. It operated up at 1,000 degrees centigrade. And so that graphite, looking through the peepholes in the reactor, you could see white hot graphite, which is sort of an interesting thing to see. But that project was not large in comparison to today's funding levels, but it was a $3 to $4 million project, and I finished the job and closed it out with less than $200 left in the books and no overrun. So I got a commendation for that job, which I was quite proud of. But from there, then I diverted into other project engineering jobs. One was in Idaho Falls. We had a test facility over there putting in test loops in the engineering test reactor that was closer to reactor operations type work. We had to modify an operating reactor. But that was some of my interesting project years before I got into jobs later on, which was the FFTF and the FMEF, Fuels and Materials Exam Facility. I always make the statement that every project or every job that I worked on up until the FFTF was constructed was completed and put into operation. Every project after FFTF was shut down and closed out before it was completed. So that was kind of a breaking point for me. And Hanford, of course, reached its peak of production, and I could talk something about that as far as reactor operations is concerned. But I wasn't really in operations. I was in engineering and had jobs all over the project. So I never was tied down to one location. It was interesting. So I had an interesting career in a lot of different projects, and I enjoyed my work and had a good time and a good married life, and I can go into that too if you wish.
So you say you were with GE this whole time. You didn't switch over to different contractors as they came in?
Well, yes, I just was GE until they left, and then Battelle came in '65. So I was with Battelle for '65 until '70 when Westinghouse took over the breeder program. And initially, Westinghouse was just brought in for the fast flux test reactor to manage that. And I happened to be working on a development job. That's one I haven't mentioned yet. When Westinghouse came in, I was assigned, that was my first manager job. I had a group or a section in the 321 building in the 300 area, and a job which was identified as the hydraulic core mock-up. And we designed, built, and operated models to evaluate the design configuration for the FFTF. So we built water models to look at a lot of different features, the reactor vessel arrangement and the core arrangement and the structure and the inlet plenum and the outlet plenum. We built several models. The two biggest ones were the inlet model, which evaluated the sodium distribution in the inlet plenum and feeding characteristics for the fuel channels. I worked on that job for 7 years. And then during that time, of course, the FFTF came under construction. And our group actually influenced the design which was being done by Westinghouse back east. And there was a lot of the features and arrangements and and shapes of the vessel and the flow distribution in the core that was determined by that hydraulic core mock-up test facility. Then when they started putting the reactor together, I was assigned to construction out in the 400 area. And I spent one whole year inside the reactor vessel helping engineer putting the parts together. One of our humorous comments about FFTF was, from our perspective, was FFTF. Do you know what that stands for? Yeah, it stands for field file to fit. With all the tight tolerances and all the arrangements necessary to make everything fit and go together. It was well engineered and well designed, but there was still engineering problems had to be resolved in the field. So that was another interesting project. And following that, then I spent 7 years on the FMEF, the Fuels and Materials Exam Facility, designing and coordinating the design, the management of the design, which was done by an off-plant architect engineer. And there again, that was a project that was not completed. It was shut down, and when the breeder program was curtailed. So following that, I could go into more details where we did various and sundry work, but it was all toward the new mission for the Hanford site, which was cleanup, starting in that field in the late 80s and early 90s. I retired officially in 89, but I worked consulting for 4 years after that. So my career actually spanned from 1951 to 1994.
How disappointing was it when FFTF got canceled?
Pardon me?
Was it disappointing when FFTF got canceled?
It was very discouraging, yes, that they were going to close it down. When they drilled a hole in the core support structure, like drilling a hole in my heart. Matter of fact, I got some pictures that show that I was the last person in the FFTF vessel before they closed it up and started filling it with sodium. But matter of fact, after that closure, after that photograph that I have, I'll be happy to show you, they had an accident with the fuel charging machine. Went up to the top of the travel, and the upper limit switch failed, and it dropped down on the core and broke some of the components that I was so proud of getting installed properly, the core support structure, and we had to go in there and do some repairs. But then after that, I left the FFTF and went to work on the design for the FMEF.
Did life sort of change day to day when you switched these contractors? How sort of different was it working for these different companies?
The only difference that I could see was a change in the color of the paycheck. As a matter of fact, when we transferred from, let's see if I can remember which contract that was it GE to Battelle or Battelle to Westinghouse? I don't remember, but at the end of that day, we were terminated, and I happened to be in a party down at one of the local pubs, which I didn't very often frequent, but somebody said, "Oh, who do you work for?" And I said, "Well, at the moment, I'm unemployed," because that was the day we were left one contractor and started with the next one. But the transitions were quite smooth, I would say. I mean, of course, policies change and your managers change. At one time, in a 2-year period, when Westinghouse came in, I think I had 13 different first-level and second-level managers above me changed within those 2-year periods. So there was a lot of personnel changes. But a lot of us working closer to the ground floor, there was very little change.
Let's back up a moment. What were your first impressions of Hanford and the area?
Well, I came here in the summer it was in July. I got here on July 3rd in 1951, and I was assigned to the barracks out in North Richland, women's barracks, as a matter of fact. That's where all the dormitory rooms were filled up in Richland for the men's dorms. So I was assigned out there for my quarters, and the next day I learned that you didn't have to drive the buses around. You could ride the city buses or the plant buses. Plant buses to ride to the area was 5 cents, and city buses, I don't remember whether they were 5 cents or free. But I rode that bus the next day that I went to work, and it was 105 degrees that day, and I thought, my Lord, what have I gotten myself into? This is horrible temperature. But I was young and willing to accept anything that came my way, so I guess I didn't think it was too serious a problem.
How aware were you of the mission of Hanford before you came here?
Very little, probably. I knew that it was working on a war effort, but at that time nobody really, well, of course, I guess it was known they were producing plutonium or weapons from atomic weapons, but as far as the detail was concerned, I knew very little, as any young man without a college might be, because I didn't know what the plant structure was, but they told us, and we got the information from the co-workers and the other students. It was quite interesting because all the youngsters, they were working. Everybody, not the majority of people, but a large percentage of them were fresh graduates. There was the older bunch were the 30 and 35-year-olds that were working on the site. But that's when I met my wife shortly after that. In 53, we were married in 53, but I met her in 52. She had a social that was put on by YWCA, Young Women's YWCA organization. They had church-sponsored dinners one night a week, and that's where we met. And so we've been married for 62 years now.
Were there a lot of those sort of social events?
There's a lot of those that happened. As a matter of fact, the organization, I was the third set that the secretary of that organization got married. She was the secretary when I was the president of the organization, which was sort of comical, I guess.
What sort of things did you and your wife do in your spare time in the 50s and 60s?
Well, I guess bridge playing was one, and social events. We went. There was. They had a group that she was involved in called the Fireside Group that had functions and went camping and things like that. But we played a lot of bridge then.
Where did you live?
Well, I was living in the dormitories, of course, when we were married. I only lived out in North Richland in the women's barracks for a short time until the rooms became available in the dormitories down in Richland. And that's where I was living when we got married. And, of course, housing was another whole story. You had to put your name on the list to get a house, be all assigned by the government. All the housing was, of course, controlled and owned by the government. So you had to get your name on the waiting list to get a house, and we were fortunate. We got a duplex, a C house up on Wright Avenue. I got that assigned just less than a month before we were married, and so when we were married, we had a 2-bedroom duplex house up there available, and that's where we moved in and lived there until 1950. When the government decided to disperse the property, and they started selling vacant lots in 1957, and we were a junior tenant in the duplex, so we couldn't make an offer on the duplex. The senior tenants had the right to buy the duplex, so I, of course, quite aggressive in my ownership philosophy, decided to buy a lot. We purchased a lot on Newcomer, the first property that was sold, and we built a house. I started building in March of 1958. As a matter of fact, our house was the third privately built house in Richland. We had a house and were living in it before Richland was incorporated. They incorporated the city in July of 58. That was, of course, the second official designation as a corporation, because Richland, of course, was a corporation. Incorporated city before the government took it over in '43. But we built that house, and I have pictures. Quite proud of the fact that it was one of the first ones in Richland, and we're still living in the same house. I don't know what that says, but I guess the stability for one thing.
Were you involved in local politics at all?
In any what?
In local politics at all?
No, not really. They asked me a few times if I wouldn't run for the city council, but I never did. No, I never got. I'm not a politician. I didn't want to get involved in that.
Great. So you've described a number of different jobs you were doing over the first two decades or so that you were here. Could you walk us through, at least for one of those, what's sort of an average workday like?
Well, let me see. There was one, I guess all of them were similar in a lot of respects. I was doing, on those jobs, I was doing project engineering, and that meant the coordination of, and the, I guess you call it management, although there was, of course, the organization like GE. There's so many levels of management that it comes through that it's a little hard to say you've managed it because you have so much supervision and overhead actions that are taken on a project, for example. But on most projects, the project engineer would write the project proposal based on what the technical department would have as input for a required facility, for example. Like the high temperature lattice test reactor, the physics department had specified that the programs that they were involved in would want to look in more detail at lattice spacing in graphite reactors, for example. So they'd write a document which would specify what their objective was and what their basic criteria was for that facility. And the project people would maybe take that and issue an order for another group to do the detailed process or the conceptual design, or do it themselves. We do it sometimes on a small project. We had projects all the way from, modifying one laboratory up to a whole facility. So it's hard to describe the same process for all of them. But it was office work, engineering work. Some of the times I was in a design group where we were actually doing detailed design work. But most of my work was in the project engineering field where we were seeing the work done by others or, specifying details or managing the people that were doing the detailed design work. But it was office work, and of course when the construction started, that's when the project engineers were more in control because they were directing the contractors as far as the field work was concerned. And that was always an interesting job, an interesting challenge, I thought, preparing contract bid packages and office work. Lots of times the projects were out in the field, of course, out in the area. We'd drive government cars to the work. And that was an advantage, of course, being in engineering rather than operations, where you had more control of your time from the standpoint of, individual management, because we used government cars for transportation. And we didn't have computers in the early stages, obviously. It was when they came out with DSIs, don't say it in writing, that was a big move too. But certainly a lot of progress and a lot of technology changes over the years.
How much were security or classification a part of your work?
Well, it was certainly an overview all the time, all the documents. If the job had classified work on it, you had to get the documents classified and follow the restrictions for those particular elements or documents, whatever's involved. Most of the time, of course, construction was not too rigidly controlled or administered, I guess, in later years, because for example, the research work was not really high classified. A lot of it wasn't. But it was always something that was there. And of course, the badging was always, I remember one time incident I had, which was funny, rather humorous. I was in a meeting out in one of the 100 areas in a back room of some building, and we were having a discussion, and all of a sudden the door burst open and two patrolmen came in and said, "Where's Ballard?" "I'm over here." "Hey, come with me." They took me by the arms and whisked me outside the badge house, and I said, "What's going on? What's the problem?" And they said, "You don't have a badge." And I said, "What do you mean I got a badge?" And I looked at it, it was somebody else's badge name. Well, they'd given me the wrong badge. So they were, I guess, vigilant in their control, but some of the times you thought it was a little overreach, but it was always there, that's for sure.
You mentioned a couple of jobs, not necessarily at Hanford, but I think you said Idaho Falls at one point, or other locations around.
Yes, we had a project, I guess I sort of skipped over that, in the engineering test reactor in Idaho Falls. The fuels people here, research people, wanted to do some testing in the engineering test reactor with certain issues or problems that they were trying to develop from the fuel technology. So we put in 2 high-pressure loops over there. And again, I was the project person on it. I didn't do the design work. I did the procurement and the construction management. Phillips Petroleum was the operating contractor over there at the engineering test reactor. And so I went over there and saw that those loops were completed and put in place in operation. And it was in 1958. I spent most of that year over there, back and forth. My wife was really unhappy because that was the year that we had started our house, and so I had coming home on weekends and trying to keep that sorted out because we had a foreman working with the carpenters building the house. So it was kind of stressful for her, but yeah, and then I had to go back for the next year after that for some cleanup work on the project. But it was another project that was managed by Hanford, but installed in a reactor over there.
So I'm curious how sort of insular Hanford was versus how much it was common for people to get advice from outside of the area or to travel to different facilities and learn what they were doing or share what you were doing with others.
Well, I think that's probably more prevalent in the technical field than it is in the construction area. Yeah, there certainly was in the nuclear complex. There was, and we did have travels. I did visit some other sites occasionally in laboratories on some of the projects we had, but most of that was done by the technical department, not the engineering department.
How much has the community changed in any particular ways over the time you've lived here?
Well, it's gone from a small community to a much higher traffic area than it used to be, but the people stay, it's still pretty mild. Of course, I've traveled to Los Angeles quite a bit. I had relatives in Los Angeles, and I'm sort of accustomed to that melee down there too, but it's still, the Tri-Cities is still a nice place to live, I think, and it's not, doesn't have a lot of the big city hubbub that the other places do, but it certainly has changed a lot from what it was when I came. My wife came in 1944, and of course that was when it was sand and dust piles and no trees and no grass, and it was a lot like that when I came too, although it was developing. But the first few years that the Manhattan Project workers were here, they had some pretty rough goes. And of course, the government-operated city was an entirely different situation than we have now with privately ownership and private management of the company or local management of the company. There, when the government operated the city, it was, you've heard these stories before, I know, even the light bulbs were changed by the employees of the government. And so that was a big change. But when we were married, first got married, of course, we were renting from the government, but that as soon as they sold the houses, we built our own, then we were on our own. And so we've lived pretty much as a private city in all of our married life. So that hasn't been a major change.
Anything else? Nothing in particular I'm fishing for here. Anything else come to mind as far as changes in sort of, I don't know, spirit of work at Hanford or changes in the communities?
Well, the government management of the Hanford site has certainly undergone a lot of changes, much as our society has, I think, over the last 50 years. When GE operated the plant, I felt, and a lot of us I thought felt, that the program was defined in general in scope, and the contractor was given a block of money, and there they went, and they did the job. They weren't they didn't have the oversight or the detailed management or the daily exchange as much with the government, I think, as they do now. I think that's been a change in philosophy or a change in detail of management more. Of course, a lot of it is because the public has been more closely involved, like with the different committees that are involved in oversight with the DOE. They didn't have that at that time. Of course, when the Manhattan Project started, it was even further away than that. Nobody outside the project knew what was being done. They were building an atomic bomb, and nobody knew what was done except the organization involved in it. And now anything the government does, it's public knowledge and has 100 different reviews over a period of a decade before they get anything done.
Of course, all these decades we're talking about here are during the Cold War, and nuclear weapons are wrapped up in a lot of that, and nuclear power. Was that ever something that was on your mind, or that you were aware of, or was that just something that was going on far away?
No, I think the Cold War and the conflict with Russia was well known, of course, because of all the cautions and concern about the atomic weapons, and people during the crisis, that peaked in the early 60s when we were in hard conflict with Russia. A lot of concern about what might happen, and it was a different era, and there was a lot of awareness of the potential that there could be a nuclear conflict.
Did it ever impact your life or your wife's life more or less directly?
Well, I don't think we thought we were protected. We thought we had the national security to take care of it, and I guess you didn't really worry about it. It's just something you didn't really dwell on, I don't think. Although they told the students and the kids that some people did build bomb shelters. My neighbor, Dr. Petty, they had one at their house under the lawn in the front yard. When they built a house, they put in a bomb shelter. Nobody knew about it but them, but I knew about it.
You ever see the inside of the shelter?
I never was in it, no. But I know it's there.
So I guess we've sort of covered this. Could you describe the ways in which security and/or secrecy at Hanford impacted your work?
Well, I guess from the work that I did in engineering specifications and drawings and documents that related to projects, we had to worry about the classification on them, and you had to worry about the access to different projects and different facilities. Of course, you had to have the right clearance, so it was a restraint on work in some respects, but it wasn't a major impact, I don't think.
In more recent years, well, I guess I don't know how long, you've been working with the Reactor Museum Association and other groups interested in the history of the local community. Can you tell me how you got involved with that and sort of the history of that?
Sure can. I retired in '89, and then, as I said, I went back to work on a part-time basis. But during that period, the environmental impact statements had been written, and the mission at Hanford was changing from production to cleanup, and all the documents and all the philosophy that was being disseminated was we were going to tear everything down and dispose of everything on the project. And I was the representative to the Tri-City Technical Council. That was a group of all the local affiliates, or all the local sections or groups from the technical societies: engineering, civil, mechanical, electrical, nuclear, women's all the technical organizations had what they called the Tri-City Technical Council. And we met monthly and addressed issues for technology dissemination or issues that might affect the community from what we might recommend or so forth. And from that group, we knew what the DOE was getting into, transition-wise, into the cleanup of the site. And they were going to tear everything down. And we said, well, we don't want that to happen. Some of these historic facilities. The B reactor, for example, was the world's first production reactor, and it was very consequential from the history both of our nation and then the world as far as that, and also a kickoff for nuclear power. So we said we ought to do something about that. So we formed a committee, and I was one of the people of that committee, and we met in July of 1990. It was our first meeting, and we talked about an organization and how we might form a group that would lead toward the preservation of B reactor. And we decided to form an association, so we had an attorney draw up our bylaws, and we formed an organization called the B Reactor Museum Association. We got our state corporate action, I forgot what the word is they used to describe the initiation of the organization, in January of 1991, but I consider the organization being formed in 1990. And our objective was to educate the public and about the historical significance of B, and to do what we could to preserve the reactor, to see that it was preserved, to gain access and to develop exhibits and so forth for the reactor. So that was where we started, was way back in 1990. And all during the decade of the 90s, we were meeting and fighting with the Department of Energy because they had milestones after milestones that were established on the cleanup and disposal of all the reactors. B was put into the list later on, but it was always on the list for cocooning, as all the reactors would be. We got those milestones extended over the years, and finally, with persuasion and meeting with legislators, with Sid Morrison. I met with Sid Morrison. I don't remember the year now, but it was one of the first times he was sympathetic for the seeing that we preserved that historical relic, and of course later on Doc Hastings. And we had many meetings and persuasions with all the legislators, and of course Cantwell and Murray got on board over the years, and it later progressed into the fact that we wanted to have a study to see if the Park Service could preserve it. At one time during the late 70s, I believe it was, several people thought that the Reach would be the only possibility for preserving the B reactor. They would be the ones that would sponsor the tours and provide for the access and so forth. And I said, no, I don't believe that. I said, I think we want to get the Park Service involved, because I don't know that the Reach is going to have the muscle to do it. So we got meetings with the legislators and got a study authorized for the Park Service study. And that was after 2 or 3 years of trials and tribulations, was finally approved. When the Park Service first came out, you're probably aware of the fact that they just had Los Alamos as the sole main site for the park. And we said that would never sell. It had to include all the sites, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford. So they revised their study and made it a 3-site park. That was eventually approved, and then later legislation, Doc Hastings and Cantwell got the park legislation authorized. And Burma, of course, has been involved, been the agency chipping at their heels all the way through all this. And we finally got credit for it. For many years, they didn't really recognize Burma as the organization that made it happen, but I think we had an awful lot to do with what made it happen.
Were you ever associated with any of the other local history-related groups?
Well, yes, we were affiliated with the Crest Museum. We worked with them, cooperated with them, and the Reach also. But we were the ones that were pushing the B reactor specifically. We still have a lot of partnerships. We had memorandums of understanding with DOE and with the Crest and with, I guess we don't have one with the Reach, but we still meet with them. Matter of fact, right now, they're working on this new exhibit for the Cold War exhibit. And of course, there's 4 of us from Burma that are on those meetings, but there's a lot of other community leaders involved too, obviously. And that was what happened. Is Burma was the organization that was in the trenches early on, but later on the whole community and the region and the legislators all got on board, and so that there was a lot of emphasis and support for getting it preserved and getting it converted or made into a National Historic Park. But have you seen the plaque out there at Reactor that says that we were the ones that initiated the plan to preserve it? So, yeah, I think I'm quite proud of that. I was one of the founding members of the organization. So,
why did it matter to you?
Well, it's important, I think, to preserve the history. That it's a significant part of the nation's history, and if it's going to be educational for a good place for the students and the young kids to come up and learn what the nuclear industry is all about. I still say, and I've said for 20 years, that I don't know how many years down the road it's going to be, but I think nuclear power is going to be a major source of energy. Commercial, electrical, as well as, of course, all the other fields. It's medical and research, and it still has an important place to play in our total nation's history, I think. And we need to know how it started and the problems it caused. Let's not generate those again. So that's the story that's going to have to be told in the park, and I think a lot of people, that's some of the emphasis. People come out, see the comments in the paper about all the negative comments. Well, that's true, but the story is still there. It needs to be told.
What would you like future generations to know about working at Hanford or living in Richland during the Cold War?
Well, I don't know. It was a challenge, I guess, and the success. I'm glad that we developed the bomb rather than Hitler. Like old Fermi said, when he was working on fission in Italy in the late 30s, or late 1930s, yes, he always said he was eternally grateful that he didn't learn how to control fission then. It said if he had, Hitler would have started the war with it rather than us ending the war with it. So I think they need to know what the conditions were at the time that the Manhattan Project was built and what the world was undergoing at the time.
What else should I be asking about? What else is there that we should discuss?
I don't know. I think I've pretty well spelled everything I know. Unless, I don't know, I could mention about my, of course, as you know, I was not here during the Manhattan Project. It was over when I came in 1951. My wife and her family was a different story. They came with DuPont in 1944. So her dad was a DuPont employee, and he came out here at that time and saw the conditions and the employment problems that they had at that time. He was a machinist and actually directed the tech shops out there for many years. But so he probably, and that family has more history of the Manhattan Project than I do. Mine is just history. But it was, I've had an interesting career, and I guess I've enjoyed it here, and it's been a wonderful place to live. And I think it will continue to be if we have people that keep our city from growing into something that it shouldn't be. But I guess I don't have any new subjects to talk about unless you have new questions.
I think that's my list for now. But thanks so much for being here.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
All right. Great.
I had a question. Can I?
Please.
One of the jobs, you had a wide variety of jobs. All of them sounded fascinating to me.
All very interesting, yes.
Yes. One caught my ear because I've seen these. Tell me what it was like when you said you worked on one of the K reactors to lay it. You said you were laying up the block. Describe what that process.
Well, I wasn't involved in that deeply as a lot of the fellows were. I can't remember his name right now, but the primary engineer that had the graphite technology, That graphite was machined in the 101 building. Well, actually, the old reactors was machined in the old 101 building in White Bluffs. They built a new building, the 2101 building in the 200 East area, which was specifically for the graphite machining and test layups. Those blocks were built to very tight tolerances. The graphite came in square blocks from the manufacturers, and they had to be machined to the final configuration. And those tolerances were very, very tight, like plus or minus 2 mils or 5 mils at the most. And the blocks were basically 4 3/4 inches by 4 3/4 inches by 40 some inches long, the main blocks. And after they were machined to very close tolerances, they were test stacked in the 2101 building, laid up 10 tiers to be sure that the tolerances of the assembly were precise. And from there, they were packaged on pallets in sequence that they would go in. I mean, in reverse sequence. So when they took them off, they were ready to be stacked up, and then they were shipped or brought into the reactor vessel, lowered down into the open process area or into the center part of the core, and pulled off of the pallets and just stacked piece by piece. There's pictures available that you see of the old reactors. There may be some of K reactors too, I don't know, but show the inside the reactors when they're laying up those with the blocks. And of course, everybody's in whites. Their cleanliness control was very important. And of course, obviously, sequence was very, very important. Have all the blocks in there. But from my perspective, I just watched. I wasn't doing the work. I was just part of the process that was putting him in there. And it was a very closely controlled and very temperature controlled. Well, no, I don't know about the temperature. The building, of course, was, I guess, under limited temperature control. But the cleanliness was strictly controlled, and the workers, of course, had been assigned with each pallet that came in. They knew where it went and how it was to be laid. But that was the same process that was used in all the reactors, of course, for graphite layup. But that's amazing, the way they built those things, and you have all the penetrations. Like I can't give you the numbers. K reactors were bigger than the original reactors. The original reactors had 2004 process tubes. And you probably all know the story of that too, but what I was starting to say was the alignment of the holes in the blocks, of course, had to line up with the holes in the penetrations of the front and rear faces precisely when they put them in. So it was like putting a watch together on a 40-foot square, 40-foot cube. Very precise work.
Were there ever any mistakes?
Pardon?
Did you ever see any mistakes?
Well, no, if they were corrected as they went, because they had 2 or 3 levels of inspection, verifying that they were going in properly. There may have been some, I don't know. I was not in direct control of that job. I was more in the K reactors. I just was an oversight. Don't remember what my position was at the time, but the B reactor, for example, what happened there when they started it up. It died because of the xenon poisoning. It didn't have enough neutron flux levels to override that poisoning effect. That's when they had to add the additional fuel channels outside the original 1500 that they had to dupe that the physicists said was adequate to drive the reactor. So that was an interesting job they had to. But the later reactors, they had more knowledge, of course, of what the requirements were. So the design didn't create a problem on initial startup like the B reactor did.
If we were trying to outline or sort of highlight what sort of innovations came out of Hanford, what sort of inventions did you see, or sort of what new knowledge or techniques did you see created at Hanford?
Well, there again, you need to talk to the physicists and the chemists and the people that were in the fuel design areas. There was so many changes made to the fuel designs. They went from, and of course these were only applicable to the graphite reactors. The fuel originally were 8 inches long, when the distortion that occurred in the graphite, that was because of the structure change due to the radiation in the graphite. The channels were distorted to the point where some of them were so crooked that the 8-inch channel, the fuel wouldn't go through the channel. So they went to 4-inch long fuel assemblies in some of those bad channels. And then, of course, another knowledge was the design of the fuel assembly. They went from strictly external core, where they just had an annulus of water around the outside cooling the fuel assembly. They went to a center bore. They had internal cooling, a flow channel through the center of the element. But as far as the physics of the elements, of course, they went from totally natural uranium originally, 238, all natural uranium with its 0.7%, 235. They went to some enrichment in the reactors to increase the power level. But there was physics changes all along as far as being able to control and just knowledge of impurities and what the effects were in the nuclear the physics involved in the reactor. But of course, then the breeder program, we didn't talk about that. There's a lot of advancements made there. FFTF was a marvelous machine, and it produced a lot of new information from breeder technology. That FFTF was, I spent 10 years on the development, and 7 on development and 3 on construction. So, but I'm not a physicist and wasn't into the technology as much as people were. I was more into construction, design and construction.
A lot of knowledge there too, even if hands-on knowledge as well.
Well, I always pride myself in being able to fix problems. We had a lot of things in assemblies or putting the stuff together, or just problems or interferences or arrangements that weren't thought of in design that we were able to resolve in the field, and that's why I got into. I've been building houses for Habitat now for the last 15 years. It's a little different from putting reactors together, but it's. I get a lot of comments from the construction people in Habitat. This is not a reactor. We don't need to have those tolerances. But I say if you make it right, it looks a lot nicer and it goes together better.
All right, I guess that's the list of questions I have. Thanks a lot once again.
Okay, well, appreciate it.